The airport was busy that morning. Passengers rushed through the bright terminals, dragging suitcases, calling family, or staring at their phones. Among them walked a tall black man dressed in a sharp suit. His calm steps and confident expression showed he was no ordinary traveler. He was a CEO, the head of a powerful company that worked with international corporations. He had taken many flights before, but today's journey would become one he would never forget. When he reached the counter, the airline staff greeted him with polite smiles. His ticket was for first class, and he had paid for the very best service. As he walked through security and into the exclusive lounge, some passengers recognized him. A few whispered his name, surprised to see him traveling alone without assistants or bodyguards. But he didn't need them. He was a man who commanded respect just by the way he carried himself. Soon, boarding was announced. First-class passengers were called first, and he stepped into the line. He walked calmly down the jet bridge and entered the aircraft. The first-class cabin sparkled with luxury, wide leather seats, glowing lights, soft music in the background. Flight attendants stood ready, smiling at passengers as they entered, but when the CEO stepped forward, he noticed something strange. The smiles directed at him were not the same as the ones given to others. When a wealthy couple entered just before him, the flight attendants greeted them with cheerful voices and offers of champagne. But when he showed his ticket, the greeting was colder, shorter. "Seat 1A, one attendant said quickly, pointing without looking him in the eye. The CEO raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He was used to unfair treatment in certain places, but he always believed in handling things calmly. He walked to his seat, placed his bag in the compartment, and sat down. His eyes scanned the cabin. Every passenger around him was being treated with warmth, compliments, drinks, even small jokes. But when the attendant passed him again, there was no smile, no welcome drink, not even a glance. He adjusted his tie and leaned back. Interesting, he thought. Let's see how this plays out. The other passengers noticed it too. A man in the row behind him raised his brows, as if wondering why the crew seemed to ignore him. A woman across the aisle gave him a small, sympathetic smile, as though she understood what was happening. Soon, the plane filled with passengers, and the cabin doors closed. The crew began their safety demonstrations, moving down the aisle with professional gestures. The CEO watched quietly. He wasn't the kind of man to demand attention, but he knew respect when he saw it, and disrespect when it was clear. As the engines roared and the plane lifted into the sky, he closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the steady hum. He had important business waiting for him in another country, meetings with high-level officials. But right now, all he had to do was relax and enjoy the long flight. At least, that was what he expected. When the seatbelt signs turned off, the attendants moved quickly, setting up the first-class service. Fine tablecloths, silverware, and menus were given out. One by one, passengers made their choices. The smell of roasted chicken and seasoned fish filled the air. Glasses clinked as champagne was poured. The CEO waited patiently, expecting the same service. But as the carts moved down the aisle, something unusual happened. Trays were placed in front of every seat, except his. He glanced around. The couple across the aisle received their meals, smiling as the attendant bowed slightly. The man behind him was served wine and a perfectly arranged plate of food. But when the cart stopped at his seat, the attendant looked at the list, then shrugged. "I'm sorry," she said in a flat tone. "We've run out." The CEO's brows furrowed slightly. He had been watching carefully. He had seen the trays stacked neatly on the cart. He knew there were still meals left. Yet here she was standing in front of him, claiming there was nothing. For a second, the cabin grew quieter. Some passengers glanced in his direction. The woman across the aisle looked shocked, whispering to her husband. Everyone in first class knew the truth. Meals in this section never ran out. Passengers paid too much for that to happen. But the CEO didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply gave the attendant a long, steady look. Her eyes flickered, but she quickly moved on, pretending nothing had happened. The CEO leaned back in his seat, his face calm, but inside his mind was sharp and alert. So this is how it is going to be, he thought. He had been denied a basic service, not because of shortage, but because of something else, something deeper. He glanced around at the other passengers. Some avoided his gaze, uncomfortable with what they had witnessed. Others shook their heads quietly, clearly disturbed. A few gave him apologetic looks, as if to say, "We know this is wrong, but we can't interfere." The CEO folded his hands together and smiled faintly. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he was already planning. He knew the truth. Sometimes silence was the most powerful weapon. Sometimes patience revealed more than confrontation. He closed his eyes once again, appearing calm. But behind those eyes, a storm was forming. The flight had only just begun. But what had happened at that table would change everything by the time the plane landed. The smell of food filled the first-class cabin. Plates clinked softly as passengers enjoyed their carefully prepared meals. Some sipped wine, others cut into tender steaks or fresh fish. The sound of forks against fine china created a rhythm of comfort. But at seat 1A, the black CEO sat in silence. His tray table was empty. The attendant had said the meals were finished, but his sharp eyes had caught the truth. He had seen at least 2 more plates left on the cart when she moved it away. He knew what had just happened. He had not been forgotten. He had been refused. The woman across the aisle gave him a look of sympathy. She whispered to her husband, "That's not possible. They always carry extra." Her husband shook his head, glancing nervously toward the attendants. Other passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. The air was no longer only filled with the smell of food. It carried unease. The CEO leaned back calmly, folding his hands together. His face betrayed no anger. If anyone looked at him, they would see a man simply resting. But inside, his mind was recording every detail, the exact words spoken, the expression on the attendant's face, the reaction of the passengers. He was a businessman. Observing was his craft. Minutes passed. The attendant served drinks and desserts. Laughter from a few passengers floated in the air, but the tension remained. Everyone knew something wasn't right. The man in the row behind him muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." But he didn't speak louder, afraid of drawing attention. Finally, the CEO raised his hand slightly, signaling for the attendant. She came reluctantly, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Yes, sir." His voice was calm, steady. "I'd like to ask again. You said the meals were finished, but I saw more on the cart. Could you please check?" Her smile tightened. "I'm sorry, sir. Those were reserved for other passengers. There really is nothing left." The CEO's brows lifted slightly. "Reserved? I thought every first-class ticket guaranteed a meal." The attendant shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes, but sometimes we have shortages." He studied her face. She avoided his eyes. He knew she was lying. Before he could respond, another attendant walked by. The first whispered something quickly to her, and both glanced at him before walking away. Their nervous laughter followed them. The CEO's lips curved into a faint smile, not of amusement, but of recognition. He had seen this before, in business meetings and corporate halls. When people underestimate you, when they believe you are powerless, they reveal their true character. He sat quietly again, letting the moment grow. He wanted the crew to believe he was just another passenger who would swallow the insult. He wanted them to be comfortable in their arrogance, because, when the time came, the impact would be greater. Across the cabin, one older passenger finally spoke up. His voice was firm but calm. "Excuse me," he said to the attendant as she passed. "This gentleman hasn't received his meal. That's not acceptable in first-class service." The attendant gave a quick, dismissive nod. "We've explained the situation." She walked away before the man could argue further. The CEO turned slightly and gave the older man a nod of appreciation, but he still did not raise his voice. He had learned long ago that the most powerful response is patience. The plane continued its long flight. Hours passed. Coffee was served, then snacks, then blankets for sleeping. But the CEO never touched a plate of food. The empty tray in front of him stood as a silent witness to the insult. Some passengers looked at it from time to time, shaking their heads. The atmosphere never fully relaxed again. The attendants avoided his seat as much as possible, glancing at him only when necessary. They whispered among themselves, thinking he couldn't hear. But his ears caught pieces, small jokes, dismissive comments. He'll survive. Not like he's starving. Some people just expect too much. Each word was another note in the record he was keeping in his mind, but still he smiled faintly, leaning back, closing his eyes as though resting. Inside, he was already planning what would happen when the plane touched down. He was not just any passenger. He was a man with power, power greater than the crew could imagine. Near the end of the flight, when breakfast was served, the attendants made no effort to correct their mistake. Once again, every passenger received food, croissants, fruit, hot tea, except him. This time, the whispers grew louder among the passengers. A woman shook her head angrily and said aloud, "This is disgraceful." But the crew ignored her. The CEO accepted it silently, taking a sip of plain water. His calm expression never broke, but his silence was not weakness. It was strategy. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice filled the cabin, thanking passengers for flying with them. The attendants moved down the aisle, smiling again, collecting trays, preparing for landing. To them, the flight was over, and they believed they had gotten away with their arrogance. But the CEO sat quietly in seat 1A, his hands folded, his mind sharp. He knew what awaited them after the landing. He had not spoken loudly, he had not demanded revenge in the air. But on the ground, when the world of business and authority returned, the balance of power would shift completely. The crew had treated him as if he were powerless. Soon, they would discover the truth. They had chosen the wrong man to underestimate, and the story of this flight was only just beginning. The plane continued its journey high above the clouds. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, but inside first class, the air felt heavy. Most passengers were quietly enjoying their meals, watching movies, or reading books. But every so often their eyes drifted toward seat 1A, the one seat with no meal tray, no service, no smile from the attendants. The black CEO sat there calmly, his back straight, his hands resting on his lap. He looked like a man who wasn't bothered, but the truth was different. Inside, his mind was sharp, recording everything. He wasn't just a hungry passenger, he was a leader, a man used to facing bigger battles than this. He knew when to act and when to wait. Across the aisle, the woman who had noticed earlier leaned toward her husband again. "They're ignoring him on purpose," she whispered. Her husband sighed, nodding. "It's shameful. I've flown this airline for years, and I've never seen such behavior." Behind him, another passenger muttered under his breath, "If this is how they treat first class, I wonder how they treat economy." The whispers spread. It wasn't just about food anymore. Everyone could feel the disrespect in the air, and it made them uneasy. The CEO pressed the call button once more, calmly. A different attendant arrived this time, smiling politely, but with a rehearsed stiffness. "Yes, sir? How may I help you?" He spoke in a low, even voice. "I haven't been served. Twice now I've been told meals are unavailable. I would like an explanation." The attendant's smile faltered slightly. She shifted her weight and replied, "We're terribly sorry, sir, but there were not enough meals loaded. It happens sometimes." The CEO's eyes studied her carefully. "So you're saying a first-class cabin, where every seat is paid for, was underprepared?" Her cheeks flushed. "Well, yes, it was beyond our control." He leaned back, nodding slowly. "Interesting, because I saw at least 2 plates remaining on the cart, and yet they were not offered to me." The woman across the aisle gasped softly. A few passengers turned their heads, pretending not to listen, but catching every word. The attendant forced a smile. "Those were, accounted for." Then, without waiting for further questions, she bowed quickly and walked away. The CEO's lips curved into a faint smile, not of amusement but of confirmation. They were not only refusing him service, they were lying about it. And now, witnesses had heard everything. The whispers grew louder. A passenger behind him leaned forward slightly and said, "Sir, I saw it too. They had more meals. They chose not to serve you." The CEO gave the man a nod of acknowledgement. He didn't need to raise his voice. Others were already speaking for him, but the attendants didn't seem to care. They continued moving through the cabin, serving drinks, laughing lightly with other passengers, and pretending nothing had happened. To them, the incident was over. To the CEO, it was just beginning. Later, as the cabin lights dimmed for rest, the CEO closed his eyes. But he wasn't sleeping. His mind was working. He had faced hostile boardrooms, cutthroat competitors, and billion-dollar negotiations. He knew the power of patience. He knew the value of letting people underestimate him. The crew thought they had silenced him. In truth, they had just given him more time to prepare. The night wore on. Some passengers slept, others watched movies, but the empty tray in front of him remained untouched. It became a silent symbol in the cabin, a reminder of what everyone had seen. At one point, he overheard 2 attendants whispering near the galley. He didn't even complain much. Maybe he's embarrassed. Serves him right. Some people think money buys everything. The CEO opened his eyes slowly, memorizing their words. His calm expression never changed, but inside, his resolve hardened. Dawn approached, and the crew prepared breakfast. The story repeated itself. Croissants, fruit, and tea were passed to everyone but him. The whispers among passengers became louder this time. "This is unacceptable. Why are they ignoring him again? First-class tickets cost more than some people earn in months. This is deliberate." The attendants avoided his seat, their forced smiles now looking brittle. When the CEO finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried weight. "I want you all to remember this moment," he said, loud enough for the passengers near him to hear, "because when we land, the real conversation will begin." The attendant froze, unsure how to respond. Some passengers raised their brows, sensing something behind his calm tone. The CEO leaned back once again, closing his eyes as if to rest. But this time, the crew began to feel uneasy. His silence was no longer the silence of a weak man accepting humiliation. It was the silence of someone waiting for the right moment to strike, and in their arrogance, they still did not realize who he really was, or the storm waiting for them when the plane touched the ground. The embarrassment they thought belonged only to him would soon become their own. The cabin lights glowed softly as the long flight continued. Most passengers in first class were settled, eating breakfast or sipping hot coffee, but the mood wasn't relaxed. Everyone had noticed it by now. One man, sitting calmly in seat 1A, had been denied not once, but twice. No meal, no breakfast, not even an apology. The black CEO still looked composed, his back straight, his face unreadable, but the tension around him was heavy. The empty tray in front of him had become the loudest thing in the room. Across the aisle, the woman who had been watching could no longer hold back. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me," she said, addressing one of the attendants. Why has this gentleman not been served? The attendant froze, then forced a smile. As we explained, we ran out of meals. The woman shook her head. That's not true. I saw more on the cart. I saw them with my own eyes. Her husband added in a deeper voice, This is unacceptable. We all paid for first-class service. He deserves the same as the rest of us. Other passengers began to murmur, nodding in agreement. A man 2 rows back leaned forward and said, I've flown this airline many times. They never run out of food in first class, not unless they're choosing not to serve it. The whispers spread like wildfire. Soon, half the cabin was glancing at the attendants with questioning eyes. The CEO remained quiet, his expression calm, almost as if he wasn't part of the conversation. But inside, he noted every word. The passengers had become witnesses. They were standing up not just for him, but for fairness. The lead attendant approached, her smile tight. Please, ladies and gentlemen, this is not an issue. Everything has been handled. Handled, the woman across the aisle repeated, her voice sharp now. Handled means everyone here gets equal treatment. That man has been sitting for hours with nothing. Don't pretend it's solved. The lead attendant's face stiffened. She didn't like being challenged, especially not in front of the cabin. Madame, she said firmly, there were circumstances beyond our control. The CEO finally opened his eyes and spoke, his voice smooth and calm. And what circumstances are those? The attendant blinked, caught off guard. Well, as I said, there was a shortage. He tilted his head. A shortage in first class on a full-service international flight? The cabin grew quiet. The other passengers leaned in, eager to hear the exchange. The attendant shifted uncomfortably, her confidence slipping. It happens sometimes. The CEO's lips curved slightly, but his tone stayed calm. I've taken more flights than I can count. I've sat in first class on almost every airline in the world, and I've never seen meals run out, except tonight, and coincidentally, I am the only passenger left without one. Gasps filled the cabin. The woman across the aisle shook her head, muttering, This is disgraceful. The older gentleman behind the CEO spoke loudly now, his voice filled with anger. I've been flying for 40 years. This is intentional. Everyone here can see it. The murmurs turned into open voices. One by one, passengers expressed their disapproval. This isn't right. Why treat him differently? He deserves the same service we got. The attendants looked nervous now. Their once confident smiles had disappeared. The whispers of arrogance from earlier were gone, replaced with uncertainty. They tried to calm the passengers, but the tide had shifted. The cabin was no longer on their side. The CEO remained quiet, letting the others speak. He didn't need to raise his voice. The truth was clear, and the witnesses had made it undeniable. He folded his hands together, observing the attendants closely. Their nervousness only confirmed what he already knew. Finally, the captain's voice came over the speakers, announcing that they would begin their descent soon. The attendants hurried to prepare the cabin, grateful for the distraction. But the passengers weren't done whispering. One man leaned toward the CEO. Sir, when we land, I'll stand as your witness. I saw everything. Another passenger nodded. So will I. The CEO gave them a faint, appreciative smile. He said nothing more, but his silence carried weight. Everyone could see he wasn't just an ordinary passenger. There was something about the way he held himself, something about his calmness that hinted at power far beyond this cabin. The attendants, meanwhile, looked pale as they secured the cabin for landing. They had thought this would end quietly, that he would accept the humiliation and move on. But now they realized too many eyes had seen the truth. Too many voices had spoken. The plane dipped lower, gliding toward the runway. The CEO leaned back, closing his eyes again as if resting, but the attendants could not relax. The passengers could not forget. And the man in seat 1A, calm and silent, was already preparing for what would happen next. When the wheels touched, The ground, the fight, would not be about food anymore. It would be about respect, dignity, and accountability, and this time it wouldn't just be the passengers watching, it would be the whole airline. The plane began its slow descent, and the seatbelt sign lit up. Attendants moved quickly, collecting trays and checking belts, but their movements no longer carried confidence. Their smiles were stiff, their eyes darting nervously around the cabin. The whispers of the passengers had shaken them, and the man in seat 1A was still sitting there, calm and silent, watching everything. The black CEO leaned back, adjusting his suit jacket. On the surface, he looked relaxed, as if the long flight hadn't bothered him. But inside, his thoughts were sharp. Every detail was etched into his mind: the dismissive tone of the first attendant, the lies about shortages, the whispers he overheard, and the passengers who had stood up as witnesses. He hadn't raised his voice once, but he had gathered everything he needed. The woman across the aisle glanced at him again. Her husband whispered softly, "He's too calm. I think he's planning something," and he was. The CEO was no ordinary traveler. He wasn't just a paying passenger. He was a man who controlled corporations, signed contracts worth millions, and sat on boards that influenced industries, including this very airline. What the attendants didn't know was that their casual arrogance had placed their entire careers on the line. As the plane descended lower, lights of the city twinkled below. The CEO closed his eyes briefly, breathing slowly. To the attendants, it looked like he had given up. To the passengers, it looked like he was simply too dignified to argue. But in truth, he was waiting for the right stage to respond. The sky was not the place, the ground would be. The passengers kept whispering, "I've never seen such treatment in first class." They thought he wouldn't say anything. "He's being patient, but I hope he speaks up after landing." Their words only strengthened his resolve. The landing gear dropped with a thud, and the plane shuddered slightly. The attendants walked down the aisle, checking belts and upright seats. When they passed 1A, they didn't look at him. Their nervousness was obvious now. The CEO gave a faint smile. Silence was often more powerful than any argument, and his silence had already made them uneasy. The wheels touched the runway, and the engines roared as the plane slowed. Passengers braced themselves, then relaxed as the aircraft rolled to a stop. Applause broke out from the back rows, as was common on long flights. But in first class, the air was heavy. Everyone knew what had happened, and everyone knew it wasn't over. As the plane taxied to the gate, the attendants began their final announcements, their voices too cheerful, almost forced. They wished the passengers a pleasant stay, thanked them for choosing the airline, and smiled as though nothing had happened. But the CEO's silence was louder than their words. When the doors opened and passengers began gathering their things, the attendants avoided his eyes. Some of them whispered among themselves again, but their laughter was gone. Fear had crept into their faces. The woman across the aisle leaned toward him as she adjusted her bag. "Sir, if you need witnesses, you have them. Everyone here saw it. Don't let them get away with this." The CEO gave her a polite nod, his face calm. "Thank you," he said softly. The passengers began to disembark. Some glanced back at him, curious about what he would do. The attendants stood at the door, bowing and smiling, thanking passengers. But when the CEO approached, their voices faltered. He gave them one long, steady look, then walked past without a word. To them, his silence felt heavier than any insult. But the attendants didn't know that the real confrontation was about to begin. As he stepped into the terminal, the CEO's stride was calm but powerful. His assistant, who had been waiting, rushed to greet him. "Sir," she whispered, "everything is ready. The airline manager is here." He nodded once. "Good." The attendants who had mistreated him were still laughing nervously among themselves, not realizing that management had been alerted. They thought the flight was over. They thought the humiliation had ended in the air. But they were wrong. The CEO was silent during the entire flight, not because he was powerless, but because he was preparing. He knew that true power was not shown in anger, it was shown in action. And as he walked calmly through the terminal toward the meeting room where the airline executives waited, he knew one thing for certain: the crew that had mocked him, ignored him, and denied him dignity was about to face consequences they never expected. This was no longer about food. This was about respect, and he was ready to deliver the verdict. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate. Seatbelts unclicked, overhead bins opened, and passengers gathered their bags. In first class, however, the usual excitement of landing was missing. Instead, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone had watched it unfold. The refusal, the lies, the humiliation. And everyone was waiting to see what the man in seat 1A would do now. The black CEO remained seated until the aisle cleared. He moved calmly, adjusting his suit jacket, his face calm and unreadable. The attendants hovered near the door, their smiles stiff, their voices overly sweet as they thanked passengers for flying. They avoided looking at him directly, but he could feel their uneasiness like heat in the air. When it was finally his turn to leave, he rolled his carry-on bag with slow, steady steps. He paused briefly at the doorway, his sharp eyes sweeping over the crew. They looked back nervously, unsure if he would speak, unsure if he would embarrass them in front of everyone. But he didn't. He simply gave them a polite nod and stepped off the plane. To the crew, his silence felt almost like mercy. Some of them sighed in relief, whispering to each other that maybe the incident was over. They told themselves he was just another rich passenger who wouldn't want the trouble of a fight. But they were wrong. The CEO's silence was not surrender. It was preparation. Inside the terminal, his assistant was waiting. She was a sharp young woman dressed in a business suit, holding a tablet. She approached him quickly. "Sir," she said softly, "the airline's senior manager is here. They're expecting you in the private lounge." He gave her a single nod. "Let's go." As he walked through the terminal, the difference between him and the attendants was clear. They had no idea who he was. To them, he had just been a passenger in their care, someone they could mistreat without consequence. But here, on the ground, he walked like the man he truly was. A leader, a decision-maker, a man with influence over industries that stretched far beyond this airport. The lounge doors opened, and inside stood two airline executives in dark suits, their faces serious. They had already been briefed about the incident by the passengers who had disembarked earlier. Some witnesses had even stopped to speak directly to airline staff, reporting what they had seen. The executives bowed slightly. "Mr. Johnson, we are so sorry," one said quickly. "We've heard about the incident, and we are prepared to investigate immediately." The CEO lowered himself into a chair at the head of the table. His assistant placed the tablet in front of him, ready with notes. He folded his hands calmly, his eyes sharp. "Bring them in," he said. The executives exchanged nervous glances, but obeyed. Within minutes, the flight crew was escorted into the lounge. Their earlier confidence was gone. They stood stiffly, eyes downcast, realizing this was no ordinary passenger they had mocked. The CEO studied them silently for a moment. The room felt colder, heavier. The attendants shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "On that plane, I was not given what I paid for. That happens sometimes. Mistakes happen. But what I will not tolerate is disrespect. What I will not tolerate is being lied to, while every other passenger is served." The attendants swallowed hard. None dared to interrupt. The CEO continued, his words sharp as steel. "Do you know who I am?" One of the attendants shook their head weakly. He leaned forward slightly. "I am the CEO of a corporation that directly partners with your airline's parent company. I sit across the table from your executives in meetings. I sign contracts that affect your jobs. And yet on that plane, you treated me like I was beneath you." Gasps filled the room. The attendants turned pale. The executives stiffened, realizing the weight of his words. The CEO's eyes narrowed. "You thought I was powerless. You thought I would stay silent. Instead, you revealed who you truly are." The woman across the aisle, who had followed into the lounge as a witness, spoke up now. "I saw everything," she said firmly. "We all did. He was denied his meal. They lied about shortages. They laughed at him. Several other passengers stepped forward too, nodding. It was deliberate," one man said. "We're willing to give statements." The executives looked horrified. They turned to the CEO. "Mr. Johnson, we will handle this. Please rest assured, this behavior is not acceptable by our standards." The CEO leaned back in his chair, his face calm but his tone final. "You won't handle it alone. I will see to it personally." The attendants trembled now. Their arrogance had vanished, replaced by fear. They had underestimated the wrong man. The CEO rose slowly, adjusting his suit jacket once more. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of final judgment. When we land in life, not just in planes, respect is what matters. And those who forget that will lose everything they take for granted. The executives bowed again, apologizing over and over. The CEO gave them one last sharp look before walking out of the lounge, his assistant by his side. Behind him, the attendants knew their careers had just ended. The private lounge was silent, heavy with tension. The executives stood stiffly, their faces pale, while the flight attendants shifted nervously, their eyes darting anywhere but toward the black CEO sitting at the head of the table. He sat with calm authority, hands folded, eyes steady. There was no anger in his expression, no raised voice, and yet the room felt colder because of his silence. Everyone knew the storm was about to break. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, but cutting through the air like a blade. "On that flight I was denied service not once but twice. I was lied to, I was mocked, and I was treated as though my dignity meant nothing." One of the attendants stepped forward quickly, her words tumbling out. "Sir, it wasn't personal. We were under pressure." The CEO raised one hand, and she froze instantly, his eyes locked on hers. "Pressure does not excuse disrespect. Shortages do not excuse lies, and nothing excuses arrogance in the face of a paying passenger." The executives shifted uncomfortably, nodding in agreement. They knew he was right. The CEO leaned forward slightly. "I want to ask you something," he said to the crew. "If I had shouted, would you have listened? If I had demanded loudly, would you have treated me differently? Or was my calmness the reason you thought you could walk over me?" No one answered. The attendants lowered their heads, shame written across their faces. He continued, his tone sharper now. "You didn't just refuse me food, you refused me respect. And you did it in front of witnesses, passengers who saw and heard everything. Some of them are here now, willing to testify." The woman from the flight, who had followed as a witness, stepped forward. Her voice was clear. "He's telling the truth. We all saw it. They lied, and they treated him differently. It was deliberate." Several other passengers nodded, their presence adding weight to the confrontation. The attendants' faces turned, pale. They realized now that the passengers they had dismissed as bystanders had become powerful witnesses against them. The CEO leaned back, his eyes sweeping across the crew. "Do you know who I am?" This time, no one answered. He gave a faint smile, one without warmth. "I am the CEO of a corporation that works directly with your airline's parent company. I sit in meetings where decisions are made about partnerships, about contracts, about reputations, and tonight you revealed the true face of this airline to me." The executives bowed their heads, sweating. One of them spoke quickly. "Mr. Johnson, please understand. We will discipline them immediately. This behavior is unacceptable. But the CEO shook his head slowly. Discipline is not enough. When disrespect is this deliberate, when lies are this clear, only one solution remains. He looked at the attendants, his voice cold and final. "You're finished." The words hit like thunder. The attendants gasped, their eyes widening in horror. One tried to protest. "Sir, please, we didn't mean—" But the CEO cut her off sharply. "Intentions don't erase actions, and your actions humiliated not just me, but the integrity of this airline." The executives nodded quickly, almost stumbling over themselves to agree. "Yes, sir. We understand. Consider it done." The CEO stood slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. His presence filled the room, towering over the attendants even without raising his voice. "When people forget respect," he said calmly, "they forget the foundation of service. And when you forget that, you have no place in this industry." Attendants lowered their heads, their careers crumbling before them. The executives motioned for them to leave, their dismissal already certain. As the crew walked out, silent and defeated, the CEO's assistant leaned closer to him. "It's done, sir," she whispered, but he wasn't finished. He turned to the executives, his gaze steady. "This incident will not disappear quietly. I want a full report of how your staff are trained. I want systems in place to ensure this never happens again, not to me, not to anyone. If I ever hear of another passenger being treated with such disrespect, your airline's reputation will collapse faster than you can imagine." The executives bowed deeply, their voices trembling. "Understood, Mr. Johnson. We will implement immediate reforms." The CEO nodded once, then picked up his briefcase. His voice was calm, but his words carried finality. "Good, because the world is watching, and so am I." He walked out of the lounge, his assistant by his side. Passengers who had stayed behind to give statements watched him go, their eyes wide with admiration. The man who had been humiliated on the plane had turned the tables completely. He had walked in calm and quiet, but left as the one who decided the fate of those who had disrespected him. And as the attendants sat in another room, awaiting their dismissal, they finally understood. The silence they had mistaken for weakness was never weakness at all. It was power. The airport lounge was quiet after the attendants were escorted out. Only the CEO, his assistant, the airline executives, and a few witness passengers remained. The air was heavy, but the balance of power had shifted completely. The man who had been denied food hours ago now held the entire room in his hands. The black CEO sat calmly, his posture perfect, his expression steady. He had spoken his truth, delivered his judgment, and left no room for excuses. The executives bowed their heads in shame, their pens moving quickly as they took notes of his every demand. One executive cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Johnson, please believe us. This was an isolated case. We will make sure it never happens again." The CEO's eyes narrowed slightly. "Isolated? No. This is not isolated. This is a reflection of what happens when arrogance is allowed to grow unchecked. If it happened to me, a paying first-class passenger, it has surely happened to others with less voice, less power. Do not insult me by calling it isolated." The executive's face flushed red. "You are right, sir. We will review all records. We will interview other passengers. We will take action immediately." The CEO leaned forward, his tone quiet but sharp. "You will not only take action, you will reform. I want to see new standards for training. I want to see every staff member reminded that passengers are human beings, not targets for arrogance. You will report directly to me on your progress." The executives nodded quickly, almost tripping over their words in eagerness. "Yes, Mr. Johnson, consider it done." The passengers who had stayed behind murmured their approval. The woman across the aisle, who had first spoken up during the flight, gave a small smile. "I'm glad someone like you was there. If it had been just one of us, they might have ignored it forever." The CEO inclined his head politely. Respect is not something we can beg for. It is something every person deserves. You should not have to fight for it on an airline you paid to fly. Her husband added, "Sir, you handled it with such calm. I think that made it even more powerful. They thought you were silent because you were weak, but you were silent because you were planning." The CEO gave a faint smile. In business, patience is a weapon, and tonight, patience was the strongest reply I could give. The executives dismissed the passengers with thanks, promising compensation for the discomfort they experienced. But for the CEO, this was not about free vouchers or apologies. It was about dignity. Once the room was empty except for his assistant, the CEO rose from his chair. His assistant looked at him with quiet admiration. You could have humiliated them in the air. You could have shouted, demanded, and made a scene. Why wait until now? He adjusted his cufflinks and replied calmly, "Because anger fades quickly, but decisions made in silence last longer. They will never forget the day they mocked a man they thought powerless and lost everything." His assistant nodded slowly, understanding.